neighborhood parks in the actual ordinance, and I'll just read it out loud. The neighborhood park system means parks that are owned and operated and maintained or owned or maintained by the park system. They are generally less than 2 blocks in size, but may be larger, and are neither designated as part of the Metropolitan Council system of regional parks and trails, nor part of any of the park board's golf courses. So I have lots of non-neighborhood parks in my ward: Theodore Worth, Lake of the Isles. I have very few neighborhood parks. They are very specifically defined in the ordinance. So I just want to make sure that the question is addressed. This is not a question about doing this proposal versus doing nothing. This is a question about doing this proposal or having a referendum. So I just want to be clear. And our proposal does suggest a tax increase. I'll note that our proposal suggests a 1% tax increase for operations, so that it would be untrue to say that there is no money and specific source of tax increase addressed in our proposal, because there is. In addition to that, there are not no funding sources. There are many choices of funding sources, and there's not agreement on any of those choices, which is why we're working in collaboration with staff and others to try to find some collaboration. So it's not a question of do this and don't put any money behind it. We've made many suggestions of funding sources, and in the end, we'll have to find one that we can get the most people to agree on. With regard to holding off for the budget process, holding off for the budget process means a referendum will move forward. I'll note that the referendum is about a 5% tax increase. So if we want to have the public go out and tell us what we already know, which our parks are important, and spend a lot of money to do that, and then have the referendum pass and then have a 5% tax increase, I would say that that's just simply not leadership. Our job is to try to figure out how to get from here to there. Lastly, I just want to say we do not operate, maintain, or govern parks. That's not our role. The public decided that there would be an independent park board. I have been on record in history of saying we should eliminate the park board, so I'm not exactly like the big park board drinking the water person here. I said eliminate it a long time ago. So I just want to be clear that we don't operate, govern, maintain parks, but we are responsible for park funding. Parks funding are directly tied to us through the local government aid agreement, as well as property taxes and the Board of Estimate and Taxation. So I don't think we have the right to tell the park system what to do with their employment problems or how to deal with their equity agenda. I think we can give advice from the experience of people on the council who have worked on this issue, and certainly we can make suggestions, and I would urge folks to make suggestions to the people who have been elected by the park system. But in the end, we don't have the right to require that they do anything. This is a funding plan, and we can't tie their operational or governance or maintenance needs to a funding plan. But I suppose having a suggestion of how they could work better with the community based on individuals' experiences at the city council certainly would be appreciated. And I know they are working on an equity plan that Brad Bourne has brought up, as well as others. And if anyone wants to talk to him about how to make that work or make it better, they should feel free to do so.
Councilmember Palmisano. Thank you, Madam Chair. Councilmember Goodman took a couple of my points, but just briefly, I wanted to acknowledge that thanks to people in Southwest Minneapolis very actively involved in this, from Commissioner Bourne and his work with the Park Board, and Mark Andrew and his work on the campaign side of this, I've been talking about this at neighborhood meetings since last summer, and it's been a very long process in which the Park Board has given us to take a look at their work, to share their work publicly. I acknowledge what Councilmember Goodman said, that this ordinance does specifically define money for neighborhood parks. I think the concern is in what might be done with the other money that we haven't defined specifically for neighborhood parks. We don't want this simply to shift money from one fund to another and make it seem as though we're investing more in neighborhood parks when in fact we're not. I've also been to meetings publicly on this across the city, from Lyndhurst to Powderhorn and others on this topic. Like Councilmember Bender, I think it would be most appropriate to agree to a process to ensure equity. I don't think that given this timeline with the referendum before us that it really allows for a thoughtful approach that would be anything other than something slapped on at the end of this work. I think we really need a process. I also know that RecQuest, which Mr. Nalesny was here speaking to in the public hearing, has been another long effort, and that has been the intentions of the park to address equity and try to figure out what that means in the future. It's been acknowledged that one part of investment in neighborhood parks across the city has actually been from NRP money. On the north side, NRP money was used all for housing, and on the south side, it tended to be used more for parks. That's how parks in my neighborhoods got that initial, now deferred maintenance, but that initial equipment in the parks when the north side was spending it for other more urgent housing needs. These assets were being given into the parks. I've been quite vocal against the referendum from the start. I do believe this is a time that the city will either get closer to the park board or much, much further apart. Thank you.
Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm going to reiterate what Councilmember Goodman and Councilmember Palmisano just said. Our plan does call for an increased levy, so this making money in City Hall is just nonsense. We also have decisions to be made about our capital spending year after year, and I'm really proud of the work that our staff has done and this council has supported over the years in decreasing our level of debt. We've got a great finance department that has changed the trajectory of our spending so that we have some capacity in our capital program. So I'm willing to look at any funding source, and I appreciate our finance staff again trying to present us with some options so that we can solve this problem. One of the things I just, in listening to people's discussion, I think in some ways, and the park people would probably disagree with me, that we get a little disadvantaged by being called the #1 park system, year after year. Yes, we have a wonderful park system, and if you look at the measures that are used to determine that process, the main determiner is how far away does the average person live from a city park. And because of the wonderful investment that was done by people many, 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 many years before us, we have almost every citizen in this city less than 6 blocks from a city park. Now, how those parks have been developed and the challenges that have ensued about equity are something that absolutely is something that we should talk about as a city. But I want to reiterate that things my colleagues have said. The Park Board is an independently elected agency in our city. They are responsible for providing park services for our citizens. That's the way that people wanted this system to be done. That is, I'm sorry. That is the reason that our citizens chose to have an independent park board. So I would encourage my colleagues to participate in the park board's efforts that they're currently undertaking to look at equity. Councilmember Palmisano is absolutely right about NRP. NRP was the last big infusion of capital dollars in the park system. In the 70s, we had some federal dollars that paid for some of these rec centers that we all use. In the 1990s and 2000s, the money was from the NRP program, and it tells you because neighborhoods decided what their priorities were. They wanted their money to be spent in their parks when they didn't have higher priorities. And in North Minneapolis, people viewed housing as perhaps a higher priority, so we didn't have the capital investment through NRP that happened in other parts of the city. But we've always had a great partnership with the park board. When I hear talk of PV Park, I remember, do you remember when there was a liquor store there, Carol, at PV Park? The city participated in buying out that liquor store on the corner of Chicago and Franklin so that PV could be changed into a park. We relocated a liquor store, not a cheap venture at the time. It was almost $1 million, I believe, if I remember correctly. So we have always been partners, but we've been partners in the part that builds the system. And we cannot let buildings that are ours collectively as taxpayers go unfixed, repaired, and that is an obligation that we have. And I think it's important for us to look as a city at where our priorities are. And it's always better to take care of what you have than think about what else you could do. And that's what I'm encouraging my colleagues to do. Thank you.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to clarify, since I think some of the comments were in response to my statements, that it is correct that the $3 million increase for operations is stated as a 1% levy increase in the ordinance itself, but it is also factually correct that the capital commitment of $10.5 million does not have an identified funding source in the resolution. And that, again, is something that I will not support, and I understand others may have a different opinion, but I just wanted to clarify that that's the sort of factual information and where my position stands on funding sources related to a $10.5 million annual capital commitment for 20 years.
All right. I'm got a few things I wanted to say on this. One is I really am glad that we had this public hearing today to give us some additional comments and information before we get to the point of voting on something that has been really helpful. I did host a neighborhood meeting last night as well, and it's really interesting. It was kind of the big egghead conversation, I felt, on what were the particulars of the different proposals out there, but really showed folks are very engaged, and I'm hearing some really consistent themes in what people are bringing forward. I guess I would say kind of the big picture is I really haven't heard anyone say that they don't believe that the needs in the parks are real. So I just want to put that out there. We are kind of finding our way to what is a proposal that will gain the support of, hopefully the most number of people possible. And we're debating that, and that's what we're supposed to do as a public body, is have discussion and try to understand what's underneath the particulars of any proposal. But at the end of the day, as I've said to others, we, the city, we own the stuff in the parks, and we need to make sure that stuff is taken care of properly. And that's what I think we're discussing how to do. I appreciate Councilmember Reich also bringing up what his committee has been leading work on, which is reviewing what are the needs for our road system. And there are some very real needs there too. And I just mention that because what we do as a city, we need to do in recognition of our multiple obligations, because these are all these are the obligations of the taxpayers. And so how are we responsibly balancing those obligations and making sure that we're not ignoring them, like the needs in the parks or the needs in the roads, so that they get to a point where in the end they're costing us all more money. And so that's what we don't want to happen. And so I support Councilmember Reich's identified process for making sure we are recognizing that. I am definitely hopeful I'm going to support a parks proposal. I think we just have some outstanding questions that people have been talking about here that we need to make sure are clear. And one is this issue of what are the funding sources for any parks proposal. So I think, we've kind of had a lot of discussion of that, but in the end of the day, I need to be able to tell my constituents, this is our plan. And it's not about a one-year plan. Do we have extra money in, year 3 or year 5? But what's that sustainable funding plan that goes for whatever is the length of this proposed agreement? The other issue I wanted to make just a little bit of a comment on the neighborhood parks. And I appreciate Councilmember Goodman reading the definition. I do want to say I think that the individual who brought up the issue was familiar with that definition, and the question was really a little bit more about, is it strong enough, that definition, to ensure that we feel comfortable that funding will go to those neighborhood parks, and kind of what does that all cover? He used the example of Phelps Park, and I just say that because I am familiar with Phelps Park. The park board manages the park space there, but they lease the building itself to another entity, which I think there are a couple other examples in the park system of that. And so what happens to a park like Phelps Park, and what's its place in this plan? And so that's really more an offline conversation, but I just wanted to bring it up because I think it's one example of maybe a handful in the park system, and how would this plan address that? The other thing I wanted to mention was this, the comments about, is there a way to codify or memorialize a commitment to using a race equity framework for identifying priorities for the spending throughout the proposed period of time for funding neighborhood parks. And here I just want to say, listen, we've got the park superintendent here. We have several park commissioners here. They have been hearing these comments just as we have. I know that they have been working on a mechanism. So I just want to say too, I don't know that the question is really for the city council to create any mechanism, but the parks themselves have been working on what's a mechanism that they feel is appropriate, that has had community voices help identify and create it, and then how would it be applied. And I got to say, I feel actually confident that we may be able to cooperatively work with the park board. Is there a way that we can recognize that in either the ordinance or the resolution as a way to, again, give that comfort and codify the fact that the park board already is on this path and is, frankly, I think, on the cusp of adopting a mechanism that they believe is the most appropriate to their system. So I just wanted to say that, and I think with that, we have at least one other speaker in line, and we'll see if there are others, but our next step is, I think we may have another presentation in Ways and Means at our next cycle. As has already been described, we've asked our CFO to describe proposed funding sources for parks funding, and then we have continued this public hearing to our next committee of the whole. Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just be really brief. I, again, want to clarify the funding that is contained in Councilmember Goodman's and my proposal, our ordinance. It includes $2.5 million of existing funding through the CLIC process that is already in place for the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board in our 5-year financial direction in our 5-year budget. So the additional capital dollars are $8 million, not $10.5 million, $8 million. Thank you.
And so with that, I am going to move to receive and file the presentation from the city attorney, and then we'll go to our committee report. So I will move to receive and file that. All in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? That item is approved. In just a second, I'm looking for my agenda here.
Oh, yeah, she said.
Did anyone send me an agenda?
Continue the public hearing.
I think I already did. Do we have to vote on continuing the public hearing?
Mr. Carl, do we need to vote on continuing the public hearing?
Ms. Armstrong, do we need to vote on continuing the public hearing? A separate vote on that? Okay. All right. Then I'll move to continue the public hearing. All in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? And that item is approved. Next, we have our city clerk's office's presentation of their business plan. Mr. Carl?
Madam Vice President, in light of the time, I was under the understanding we're going to receive and file this. Unless there are questions, I can certainly respond to those offline to individual council members.
Okay. Then I will go ahead and move to receive and file the clerk's business plan. All in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? And then we have reports of committees. And then I'll just, we do have some major items coming forward this cycle. But I'll ask committee chairs to kind of highlight those top items again in light of the time. Community Development and Regulatory Services with the Vice Chair of that committee, Councilmember Frye.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We have 13 items that are being moved forward for this Friday from the Community Development and Regulatory Services Committee. First is a land sale at 2008 Glendale. Second is a series of land sales for the Hawthorne Eco Village Apartments, which is affordable housing. Third is also Hawthorne Eco Village Apartments, which is a bond issuance. Fourth is a rental dwelling license revocation, as is the fifth. 6 is a series of liquor business gambling applications. 7 is a deletion of parcels from Minneapolis housing replacement tax increment financing districts. 8th is to increase in funds to pay for correction of sewer encroachment costs related to city-owned property. 9 is a rental dwelling license operating conditions for 2548 Central Avenue. 10 is the Consolidated Action Plan for fiscal year 2016. 11 is also related to Hawthorne Eco Village Apartments and Affordable Housing TIF District. 12 is changes to our home improvement programs for Gimmick. 13 are changes to the rehab support program, accepting a Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, and other loan and bond issuances, and I will stand for any questions.
Thank you. Next, we have Health, Environment, and Community Engagement with Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Health, Environment, and Community Engagement Committee is going to be bringing 2 items forward. The first is Homegrown Minneapolis Food Council recommendations to amend our community garden lease and our commercial garden lease contracts to strike the language that says has no cost to the city. The second item is accepting a grant from Medical Research Institute with the Health Department. That's it.
All right, thank you very much. Next, we have Intergovernmental Relations. For that committee, we have an amendment to the 2016 policy positions, and then item number 2 is a donation of used fire trucks and public life safety equipment to our sister city of Bosaso, Somalia. Seeing no questions, next we have Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management with the Vice Chair, Councilmember Gordon.
I'm happy to make that report since the chair is gone. There's just 2 items coming from the Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management Committee. One is accepting a state of Minnesota GI Bill on the job training apprenticeship program payment, and the other is authorizing the police to enter into some joint powers agreements with Hennepin County Sheriff's Office, Met Transit, and Minnesota State Patrol for a 2016 safety initiative.
All right, thank you. Next, we have Transportation and Public Works. With that, Chair, Councilmember Wright.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The committee will be forwarding 16 items for consideration full council. The one main highlight would be item 7, which is design layout for 3rd Avenue, and that was forwarded without recommendation by the committee due to lack of consensus about different design layouts for a portion of that project. The remainder items could be summarized as being approvals of design, layouts, project work, consultant work, and materials purchases for our seasonal road repair program. I'll stand for questions, Madam Vice President.
All right, I am Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to note that I brought a motion to the committee that did not pass, and then therefore it was split vote on that motion to go back to a proposal for 3rd Avenue that had gone through our review process at our pedestrian advisory committee and our bicycle advisory committee, and have been working with the chair and some of the other council members to hopefully come to a consensus about this project. But regardless, this is such an important corridor for my constituents that I do plan, if there is no other proposal in front of us, to go back to that 3-lane version to bring that same motion to council on Friday.
All right, thank you very much. Next, we have Ways and Means with Councilmember Kunze.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Ways and Means has 9 items, consideration on Friday. One is the Minnesota State Environmental Grant application. And then there's an agreement with Minneapolis Downtown Council. We also have a contract amendment with NRG Energy Center. We have a license agreement with M.A. Mortensen for temporary crane encroachment. We have a negotiation authorization for potential purchase of 1501 West River Road North, a contract amendment with Deacon International for live mum support, and we have the appointed position. This is a Director of Contract Compliance. This is an upgrade of a current position, so it's not a new position within the Civil Rights Department. And then we have 2 final items, which are collective bargaining agreements. One's with the Trades Inspectors Bargaining Unit, and the other is the Electrical Technicians Bargaining Unit. Happy to answer any questions on those 9 items.
Thank you. And last, we have Zoning and Planning Chair, Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have just one item this cycle, which is an easement vacation at Augsburg College.
All right, thank you very much. And with that, I believe we have concluded with our business for today, and we are adjourned. Thank you.